The morning ceremony, the crisp London morning air, carried the familiar sounds of the city awakening as crowds began to gather outside Buckingham Palace for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Steam rose from hundreds of coffee cups clutched in the hands of eager tourists who had arrived early to secure the best viewing positions along the palace railings. The atmosphere was filled with excitement and anticipation, a mixture of different languages and accents, blending together as people from around the world prepared to witness one of Britain's most iconic traditions. Among the assembled crowd stood Guardsman Robert Hayes, a 26-year-old member of the Welsh Guards with 8 years of distinguished military service behind him. His scarlet tunic was immaculate, pressed to perfection, and his tall, black bearskin hat sat proudly atop his head, a symbol of centuries of British military tradition. Every button on his uniform gleamed in the morning light, and his black boots reflected the surrounding scene like mirrors. In his white-gloved hands held his rifle with the precision and respect that had been drilled into him through years of training and discipline. Robert had joined the army straight from school in Cardiff, driven by a deep sense of duty and a desire to serve something greater than himself. His early years had been spent in rigorous training, learning not just the physical demands of military life, but the mental discipline required to maintain composure under any circumstances. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, where he had earned commendations for bravery and had witnessed firsthand the cost of freedom so many civilians took for granted. The transition from active combat duty to ceremonial responsibilities had required a different kind of training and mindset. While the dangers were different, the demands were no less real. Standing motionless for hours at a time, maintaining perfect posture and discipline regardless of weather conditions, crowds, or provocations, required a level of mental fortitude that few people could understand or appreciate. It was a responsibility that Robert took seriously, understanding that he represented not just himself, but the entire British military tradition. This particular morning had started. Like any other for Robert, his alarm had sounded at 4:30, giving him ample time to prepare for the ceremony with the meticulous attention to detail that his position demanded. Every aspect of his appearance had been checked and rechecked, from the angle of his hat to the positioning of his medals. His rifle had been cleaned and inspected until it gleamed, and his movements had been practiced until they were as smooth and precise as clockwork. The tourists gathering around him represented the full spectrum of international visitors that London attracted every day. There were families with excited children pointing and whispering, elderly couples who spoke in reverent tones about the history they were witnessing, and young backpackers taking selfies to document their London adventure. Most approached the ceremony with respect and genuine curiosity, understanding that they were witnessing something special and meaningful. Professional photographers positioned themselves strategically, their expensive cameras ready to capture the perfect shot of the guards in their traditional uniforms. Tour guides led their groups with practiced efficiency, sharing historical facts and cultural context that helped visitors appreciate the significance of what they were experiencing. The general atmosphere was one of mutual respect and shared appreciation for British culture and military tradition. Robert had learned to tune out most of the crowd noise and activity while remaining alert to his surroundings. His training had taught him to maintain a state of relaxed awareness, conscious of everything happening around him while not being distracted by the constant stream of tourists, photographers, and sightseers. This mental discipline was essential for maintaining the dignity and professionalism that his position required. The morning sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the palace forecourt and warming the air slightly. The crowd continued to grow as the ceremony time approached, with new arrivals pushing gently forward to find viewing spots. Most people were considerate of others, understanding that everyone wanted to see and experience this iconic London attraction. The general mood remained festive and respectful, with occasional bursts of excitement when guards moved or when the crowd spotted movement that might signal the beginning of the ceremony. Street vendors had set up nearby, selling coffee, tea, and light breakfast items to tourists who wanted to enjoy refreshments while they waited. The aroma of fresh coffee mixed with the London air creating a distinctly metropolitan atmosphere that many visitors found charming and memorable. Many tourists clutched steaming cups, grateful for the warmth on what was turning out to be a typically cool British morning among the crowd. Most people understood and respected the unspoken rules that governed interactions with the guards. They knew that these were working soldiers performing official duties, not tourist attractions. Put there for entertainment. Parents quietly explained to their children why they needed to be respectful and keep an appropriate distance. Experienced travelers shared their knowledge with first-time visitors, helping to maintain the atmosphere of dignified observation that made the ceremony so special. Robert could see the appreciation in many faces as people watched him maintain his position with unwavering discipline. He had grown accustomed to the whispered conversations about his stoic professionalism, the admiring comments about his uniform and bearing, and the respectful way that most visitors approached the experience. These positive interactions reminded him why he took pride in his ceremonial duties. Understanding that he was providing people with a connection to British history and military tradition that many would remember for the rest of their lives. The morning continued peacefully, with the usual ebb and flow of tourist activity creating a comfortable background rhythm. Guards at their various positions maintained their watch with characteristic discipline, while the crowd grew steadily larger in anticipation of the ceremony. Everything was proceeding normally, following patterns that had been established over decades of similar mornings, but unknown to Robert and the respectful majority of observers. There was one individual in the crowd whose morning was about to take a very different turn, someone whose actions would transform this peaceful scene into something far more dramatic and confrontational. The stage was being set for an incident that would test Robert's training and professionalism in ways he had never experienced. Even during his combat deployments overseas, the troublesome tourist Marcus Rodriguez had arrived in London 3 days earlier for what was supposed to be a relaxing vacation. But nothing had gone according to his plans since the moment he stepped off the plane. His hotel room had been smaller than advertised. The weather had been typically British and unpredictable, and every tourist attraction seemed to be crowded with what he considered to be annoyingly slow-moving people who didn't understand how to efficiently navigate popular destinations. Marcus was a 34-year-old software developer from Phoenix, Arizona, who had built his life around routines, efficiency, and getting immediate results. In his professional world, problems were solved with code. Systems responded instantly to commands, and obstacles were removed through logical problem-solving and direct action. The messy, unpredictable nature of international travel, with its delays, cultural differences, and situations beyond his control, had been grinding against his personality. It's like sandpaper against raw nerve endings. His morning had started badly when the hotel's breakfast service had run out of his preferred coffee blend, forcing him to settle for what he considered to be inferior alternatives. The shower in his room had produced inconsistent water temperature. His phone's international data plan was working sporadically. The concierge had been unable to guarantee him the specific viewing position he wanted for the changing of the guard ceremony, which small frustration had built upon the previous ones, creating a mounting pressure of irritation and impatience that was looking for an outlet. The decision to visit Buckingham Palace had been somewhat impulsive, driven more by a sense of obligation to see London's famous attractions than by any genuine interest in British military tradition or royal ceremony. Marcus had arrived with the expectation that he would quickly snap some photos, check the experience off his tourist to-do list, move on to something more engaging and interactive. But the reality of the situation had immediately clashed with his expectations. The crowd was larger than he had anticipated, filled with people who seemed content to stand around waiting for what appeared to him to be essentially nothing happening. The guards stood motionless in their positions, which Marcus interpreted not as disciplined professionalism, but as boring inactivity that wasn't worth the time. He was investing in observing it. His irritation had been compounded by what he perceived as the inefficiency of the entire setup. There were no digital displays providing information or countdowns, no interactive elements to keep visitors engaged, no customer service representatives to manage the crowd or provide real-time updates. About timing. From his perspective, the whole operation seemed antiquated and poorly organized. lacking the streamlined user experience that he expected from any professional presentation or service. Marcus had purchased a large coffee from a nearby vendor, hoping that caffeine would improve his mood and help him find some enjoyment in the experience. But even the coffee had disappointed him, tasting different from his usual Arizona coffee shops and costing more than he thought was reasonable for what appeared to be a fairly standard brew. The paper cup felt flimsy in his hands, and the lid didn't seem to fit as securely as he preferred. Adding to his growing list of minor but accumulating frustrations, as he stood in the crowd, Marcus found himself increasingly annoyed by the behavior of his fellow tourists. Families were moving slowly and taking up more space than he thought they needed. Elderly visitors were asking questions that he considered obvious or easily answered through basic internet research. Children were being loud and distracting, and their parents seemed oblivious to how their noise might be affecting others who were trying to concentrate on the experience. The reverent attitude that many visitors displayed toward the ceremony struck Marcus as unnecessarily dramatic and probably artificially performed for social media purposes. He watched people taking careful photos and speaking in hushed, respectful tones, and interpreted their behavior as pretentious rather than genuinely appreciative. In his mind, these were just people in costumes doing jobs that appeared to require no particular skill or effort, certainly nothing that warranted the kind of awed attention they were receiving. His frustration reached a new level when he attempted to move closer, to get better photos, only to find his path blocked by other tourists who had apparently arrived earlier and claimed out what he considered to be the prime viewing positions. The polite but firm resistance he encountered when he tried to push forward struck him as unreasonable and inconsiderate, especially since he was traveling alone and therefore should logically require less space than families or groups. Marcus began to focus his irritation on the guards themselves, viewing them as the source of the inefficient and unsatisfying experience he was having. From his perspective, they were essentially performers who were failing to provide adequate entertainment value for the time and money he was investing in watching them. Their stoic immobility, which other visitors seemed to find impressive or moving, struck him as lazy and unengaging. He started to interpret their professionalism as arrogance, their discipline as stubbornness, and their adherence to protocol as inflexibility. The fact that they didn't acknowledge the crowd or provide any interactive elements made him feel ignored and undervalued as a paying tourist who had traveled thousands of miles to see what London had to offer. The mounting pressure of his accumulated frustrations, combined with jet lag, caffeine, and a personality that was accustomed to immediate solutions and direct confrontation of obstacles, was creating a volatile mixture that was looking for a target. The guards, with their apparent immunity to the concerns and desires of the tourists around them, were beginning to represent everything that was annoying him about his London experience. Marcus found himself staring specifically at Robert, positioned near the palace railings, made him one of the most visible guards, and therefore the most obvious focus for Marcus's growing irritation. The guard's perfect posture and unwavering attention to duty should have been impressive demonstrations of military discipline. Instead, struck Marcus as personal slights against his presence and his legitimate expectations as a tourist and customer. The crowd around him continued its patient observation of the ceremony preparations. But Marcus was no longer seeing the same scene they were. Where others saw tradition, history, and professionalism, he saw inefficiency, pretension, and what he interpreted as deliberate disrespect for tourists, who were ultimately funding this entire operation through their visitor fees and economic contributions to London. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shock everyone present and test the limits of military discipline and crowd control in ways that none of them could have anticipated. The breaking point, the tension that had been building inside Marcus Rodriguez throughout the morning, was reaching a critical mass, like pressure building in a steam engine with no release valve. The combination of travel frustration, cultural misunderstanding, and his own personality traits was creating a perfect storm of anger and entitlement that was about to explode into public view. What had started as minor irritations was now transforming into something much more dangerous and destructive. Standing in the crowd outside Buckingham Palace, Marcus had become increasingly fixated on what he perceived as the deliberate ignoring of the tourists by the guards. In his mind, their professional discipline and adherence to ceremonial protocol was a personal insult, a calculated dismissal of his presence and his legitimate rights as a visitor who had paid to experience London's attractions. The fact that other tourists seemed to accept and even appreciate this behavior only increased his sense of isolation and anger. The coffee in his hands had grown lukewarm, adding another layer to his mounting dissatisfaction. Grimaced at the temperature and taste, viewing it as yet another example of the substandard service and experiences he'd been encountering throughout his London visit. The paper cup felt insubstantial in his grip, and he found himself squeezing it unconsciously as his irritation continued to build around him. The crowd maintained its respectful observation of the guards, with parents quietly explaining the ceremony to their children and tourists taking careful photographs of the uniformed figures. The general atmosphere remained one of appreciation and cultural curiosity. But Marcus was completely disconnected from this shared experience. Instead, he felt increasingly like an outsider looking in on what seemed to him to be an elaborate charade designed to separate tourists from their money. While providing minimal actual value or engagement, his focus had narrowed specifically to Robert, whose position made him the most visible and accessible target for Marcus's growing frustration. The guard's perfect posture and unwavering attention to his duties, maintained despite the constant stream of tourist activity around him, struck Marcus as both impressive and infuriating. Here was someone who clearly possessed the discipline and training to maintain his composure under challenging circumstances, yet who seemed completely indifferent to the needs and expectations of the people who had come to see him. Marcus began to interpret Robert's professionalism through the lens of his own anger and misunderstanding. The guard's stoic expression became arrogance in Marcus's mind. His disciplined silence became deliberate rudeness, and his adherence to military protocol became stubborn inflexibility. Every moment that passed without acknowledgement or interaction felt like a personal slight that demanded some kind of response or correction. The breaking point came when a family with young children moved in front of Marcus, temporarily blocking his view of Robert and the other guards. What should have been a minor and temporary inconvenience triggered something much deeper and more volatile in Marcus's psychological state. The combination of being blocked, ignored, and generally frustrated with his entire London experience suddenly coalesced into a moment of irrational rage that overwhelmed his normal decision-making processes. "Excuse me?" Marcus said loudly, pushing past the family with unnecessary force and aggression. "I was here first, and I'm trying to get pictures." The family looked startled and moved aside apologetically, clearly uncomfortable with Marcus's aggressive tone and behavior. Other tourists began to turn and stare, sensing that something unpleasant was developing in their midst. The respectful quiet that had characterized the crowd began to shift into something more tense and uncertain. But Marcus was beyond caring about the reactions of other tourists or the social norms that governed public behavior in such settings. His anger had found a focus and a target, and he was determined to get some kind of response or acknowledgement from the guards who had been, in his mind, deliberately disrespecting him and other visitors through their aloof, professional behavior. He moved closer to Robert's position, his steps becoming more aggressive and purposeful with each stride. The lukewarm coffee sloshed in his cup as he walked, and he found himself gripping it tighter. Not yet conscious of what he was planning to do with it, but already feeling the weight and potential of the liquid as a weapon of confrontation. "Hey," he called out to Robert, his voice carrying across the morning air with a harsh edge that cut through the gentle murmur of tourist conversation. "Yeah, you in the big fuzzy hat. I'm talking to you." Robert remained motionless, his training and discipline keeping him focused on his duties despite the obvious attempt at provocation. His eyes stayed fixed, straight ahead, his posture remained perfect, and his expression showed no reaction to Marcus's aggressive approach. This professional composure, which should have been admirable, only served to inflame Marcus's anger further. "Don't you ignore me?" Marcus shouted, now close enough to Robert that other tourists began to back away, sensing that the situation was escalating beyond normal tourist interactions. "I've traveled thousands of miles to see this, and the least you can do is acknowledge." that people are here. The crowd's attention was now fully focused on the unfolding confrontation. With conversations stopping and cameras turning toward Marcus and Robert, parents pulled their children closer. Experienced travelers recognized the signs of an ugly tourist incident developing, and security personnel began to take notice of the disturbance from their positions around the palace grounds. Marcus was now standing directly in front of Robert, close enough that the guard would have been within easy conversational distance if this had been a normal social interaction. But Robert continued to maintain his professional discipline, his gaze fixed on the middle distance. His body language showing no acknowledgement of Marcus's aggressive presence or demanding tone. "This is ridiculous," Marcus declared, his voice rising to a level that was clearly audible across the entire crowd. "You people act like you're so important, but you're just standing around in costumes doing absolutely nothing. The least you could do is show some basic courtesy to the people who are paying to see you." The coffee cup in Marcus's hand was beginning to feel heavier. Its content still warm enough to be significant, but cool enough that he wasn't fully conscious of its temperature. His grip had tightened to the point where the paper was beginning to compress slightly. The liquid inside was beginning to slosh more noticeably with his increasingly agitated movements. Other tourists began to voice their disapproval of Marcus's behavior, with murmurs of, "That's not appropriate, and he should leave the guard alone," rippling through the crowd. But their criticism only served to increase Marcus's sense of isolation and his conviction that he was somehow being treated unfairly by everyone present. The moment of explosion was approaching rapidly, with Marcus's anger and frustration building toward an action that would shock everyone present and create consequences far beyond anything he was currently imagining. The lukewarm coffee in his cup was about to become a weapon in an act of aggression that would test the limits of military discipline and crowd control in ways that none of the witnesses could have anticipated. The shocking attack, the moment that would be replayed in countless videos and remembered by every witness present, arrived with shocking suddenness. Marcus Rodriguez, his face flushed with anger and his judgment completely overwhelmed by accumulated frustration, raised his coffee cup with a sharp, aggressive motion that immediately caught the attention of everyone in his vicinity. The lukewarm liquid inside sloshed ominously as he drew his arm back, and for a split second, the entire crowd seemed to hold its breath as they realized what was about to happen. "Maybe this will get your attention," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with rage and indignation as he hurled the contents of his coffee cup directly at Guardsman Robert Hayes. The coffee arced through the morning air in a brown stream that seemed to move in slow motion, traveling the short distance between Marcus's position and Robert's immaculate uniform with devastating precision. The liquid struck Robert across his chest and shoulder, immediately soaking through his pristine scarlet tunic and leaving dark, spreading stains across the fabric that represented centuries of military tradition and honor. The impact was both physical and symbolic, sending droplets of coffee splattering in all directions and leaving Robert standing there with his uniform defiled and his dignity under assault. The lukewarm liquid seeped through the fabric of his tunic, creating an uncomfortable dampness against his skin that he could feel spreading with each passing second. The smell of coffee mixed with the morning air, creating an olfactory reminder of the attack that would linger long after the immediate shock had faded, for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Absolute silence descended upon the crowd. Tourists stood frozen in disbelief, their cameras still recording, but their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Children pointed in confusion, not understanding why the nice soldier was suddenly wet, while their parents stared in horror at the unprecedented breach of respect and dignity they had just observed. Robert himself remained motionless, his training and discipline holding firm even in the face of this shocking assault on his person and his uniform. His eyes stayed fixed straight ahead, his posture remained perfect, and his grip on his rifle never wavered, despite the coffee dripping from his tunic and the overwhelming urge that any normal person would have felt to react with anger or self-defense. The sight of the coffee stains spreading across Robert's immaculate uniform was like a physical blow to everyone who understood what they were witnessing. This wasn't just fabric that had been soiled. This was a direct attack on everything the uniform represented: service, sacrifice, tradition, and the honor of every soldier who had worn it before. The visual impact was stunning and deeply offensive. To anyone who possessed even a basic understanding of military culture and respect, Marcus stood there for a moment, his empty coffee cup still in his hand, apparently as shocked by his own actions as everyone around him. The immediate satisfaction of having finally provoked some kind of response was quickly being replaced by the dawning realization that he had just committed an act that was far beyond normal tourist misbehavior. The magnitude of what he had done was beginning to penetrate through his anger, bringing with it the first hints of awareness that he might have made a catastrophic mistake. But the silence that had followed the attack was about to be shattered by something far more powerful and terrifying than Marcus could have imagined. The crowd that had been peacefully observing the ceremony just moments before was transforming into something entirely different. Something that would teach Marcus a lesson about respect, consequences, and the protective instincts of people who witnessed genuine injustice. The first voice to break the silence came from an elderly British gentleman who had served in the military himself decades earlier. His voice shook with outrage and disbelief as he called out, "That's absolutely disgraceful. How dare you attack that soldier?" His words seemed to break a dam, releasing a flood of anger and condemnation from the surrounding crowd that had been building since the moment. Marcus had thrown the coffee. Voices rose from all directions, creating a chorus of outrage and disapproval that grew louder and more intense with each passing second. "He should be arrested," shouted a middle-aged woman, her camera still recording as she documented both Marcus's attack and the crowd's response. "That's assault on a serviceman. It's absolutely shameful behavior," added another voice from somewhere. "In the crowd, my guard is doing his duty, and you've attacked him for no reason." The anger in the crowd was not just about the coffee stains on Robert's uniform, though those were shocking enough. It was about the deeper violation that Marcus had committed, the attack on someone who couldn't defend himself. The disrespect shown to military service and sacrifice, and the complete absence of basic human decency that his actions represented. Children began to cry, upset by the sudden tension and anger that had replaced the peaceful morning atmosphere. Parents held them closer while glaring at Marcus with undisguised disgust, many of them pointing him out to security personnel who were now moving rapidly through the crowd toward the scene of the incident. "You're a disgrace," called out a young man with an American accent, apparently feeling the need to distance himself from his countrymen's behavior. "This isn't how decent people behave." The international nature of the crowd meant that Marcus was receiving condemnation in multiple languages, with tourists from around the world united in their shock and anger at what they had witnessed. The universal nature of the outrage demonstrated that respect for military personnel and basic human decency transcended cultural and national boundaries. Marcus looked around desperately, apparently hoping to find some source of support or understanding. In the sea of angry faces surrounding him, there was none to be found. Every single person who had witnessed his attack was united in their condemnation of his actions, and their collective anger was building into something that was beginning to feel genuinely threatening. I was just ... Marcus began weakly, but his words were immediately drowned out by the continuing chorus of outrage from the crowd. "Just what?" demanded a woman with a thick Scottish accent. "Just attacking someone who can't fight back? Just showing the world what kind of person you really are?" The coffee-stained uniform continued to serve as a visual reminder of Marcus's assault, with the dark stains spreading and settling into the fabric in ways that would probably require professional cleaning to fully remove. And Robert could see the evidence of the attack, and each viewing seemed to increase their anger and determination to see justice done. Security personnel were now pushing through the crowd with increasing urgency, their radios crackling with communications. As they coordinated their response to what was clearly becoming a serious incident, the peaceful morning ceremony had been transformed into a crime scene with Marcus at the center of it all, finally beginning to understand that his moment of anger was going to have consequences far beyond anything he had imagined when he raised that coffee cup in his moment of rage. The crowd's fury, the transformation of the peaceful tourist crowd into an angry mob, was swift and absolute. Like a switch being flipped between calm observation and righteous fury. What had been a diverse collection of international visitors, united only by their interest in British military tradition, suddenly became a unified force of condemnation. Their collective anger focused with laser precision on Marcus Rodriguez. In his shocking attack on Guardsman, Robert Hayes, the elderly British gentleman who had first voiced his outrage, was now pushing through the crowd toward Marcus, his walking stick tapping aggressively against the pavement as he moved. His face was flushed with anger, and his voice carried the authority of someone who had served in the military himself and understood the full significance of what he had just witnessed. 30 years I served this country, he declared loudly, his voice shaking with emotion, and I've never seen such disgusting behavior in all my life. That young man has earned the right to wear that uniform with honor, and you've attacked him like a common thug. His words resonated powerfully with other veterans in the crowd, who began to identify themselves and add their voices to the growing chorus of condemnation. A middle-aged woman wearing a small military service pin on her jacket stepped forward, her eyes blazing with anger. My son served 2 tours in Afghanistan, she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd. He came home with medals for bravery, and men like that guard protected him and brought him home safely. What? Done is an attack on every service member who's ever worn the uniform. The international nature of the crowd meant that Marcus was receiving criticism not just from British citizens, but from visitors representing dozens of different countries, all united in their shock and disgust at his behavior. The universal condemnation demonstrated that respect for military service transcended national boundaries and cultural differences. A group of Australian tourists began chanting shame, shame, shame. In unison, their voices creating a rhythmic beat that seemed to encourage other voices to join in. The chant spread through the crowd like wildfire. People from different countries and backgrounds united in their expression of moral outrage at Marcus's actions. You should be ashamed of yourself, shouted a young mother holding her toddler, who was crying from the tension and noise that had suddenly filled the air. My daughter is 2 years old and she has better manners than you do. How dare you attack someone who can't defend themselves? The visual impact of Robert's stained uniform continued to fuel the crowd's anger, with each person who saw the coffee stains feeling a fresh wave of outrage at the disrespect that had been shown to both the individual soldier and everything his uniform represented. The dark stains spreading across the scarlet fabric served as a constant reminder of Marcus's assault, making it impossible for anyone to forget or minimize what they had witnessed. Professional photographers in the crowd had captured the entire incident, from Marcus's aggressive approach to the moment of impact to Robert's disciplined response and the crowd's immediate reaction. Their cameras continued to click rapidly, documenting not just the aftermath of the attack, but the genuine emotion and anger displayed by ordinary people who had witnessed what they perceived as a fundamental violation of decency and respect.
How this
Is going straight to the police, declared a man holding up his phone, which had been recording throughout the entire incident. You've committed assault in front of hundreds of witnesses, and it's all been caught on camera. You're going to face the full consequences of your actions. The mention of legal consequences seemed to cut through Marcus's shock and confusion, bringing him face to face with the reality that his moment of anger had created problems that extended far beyond simply being yelled at by angry tourists. The word assault hung in the air like a physical presence, carrying with it implications of criminal charges, legal proceedings, consequences that could follow him long after his London vacation was over. I didn't mean ... Marcus began weakly, but his words were immediately drowned out by a fresh wave of angry voices from the crowd. Didn't mean what? Demanded a teenage girl who was visiting London with her school group. Didn't mean to throw coffee at someone who was just doing his job. Didn't mean to attack a soldier who couldn't fight back. What exactly didn't you mean? Her articulate anger, coming from someone young enough to be Marcus's daughter, seemed to cut deeper than the shouts from adults. Here was a teenager who understood basic respect and decency better than a grown man, and her words highlighted the fundamental immaturity and selfishness that had driven Marcus's actions. The crowd began to press closer to Marcus, not with physical aggression, but with a moral authority that was far more intimidating than any physical threat could have been. He found himself surrounded by faces filled with genuine anger and disappointment. People who had witnessed his behavior and found it so fundamentally wrong that they couldn't simply stand by and watch without speaking up. "In your country," said a well-dressed businessman with an American accent, clearly feeling embarrassed to share nationality with Marcus, "that guard represents everything that's honorable about military service. And you've attacked him for absolutely no reason except your own selfishness and immaturity." A group of Japanese tourists, despite the language barrier, were clearly expressing their disapproval through gestures and facial expressions that needed no translation. Their traditional respect for authority and service made Marcus's behavior particularly shocking to them, and their visible disgust added an international dimension to the condemnation he was receiving. "My grandfather fought in World War II, called out a young man with tears in his eyes. "Gam, and he would roll over in his grave if he saw how you've treated someone in uniform. That guard could be protecting your freedom right now, and instead, he's standing there with coffee dripping off his uniform because you had a tantrum like a spoiled child." The personal nature of many of the testimonies made Marcus's attack feel not just like an assault on Robert as an individual, but like an attack on the friends, family members, and loved ones of everyone in the crowd who had connections to military service. The ripple effects of his actions were extending far beyond what he had intended or imagined. Security personnel were now visible throughout the crowd, moving steadily toward Marcus's position while speaking into their radios and coordinating with other officials. Their presence added an official dimension to the consequences that Marcus was facing, transforming the situation from a simple tourist incident into what was clearly going to become a formal legal matter. "You're not going anywhere until the police get here," declared the elderly veteran, positioning himself between Marcus and the nearest exit route. "You've committed a crime in front of hundreds of witnesses. You're going to face the consequences like a man, even if you didn't act like one." The crowd's anger showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, it seemed to be building as more people arrived and learned what had happened, with each new witness adding their voice to the chorus of condemnation. Marcus found himself at the center of a storm of moral outrage that was entirely of his own making, facing consequences for his actions that were far more severe and lasting than anything he could have imagined. When he let his frustration overcome his judgment, consequences, and justice, the arrival of Metropolitan Police officers marked the beginning of the end for Marcus Rodriguez's disastrous London vacation. The two constables who pushed through the angry crowd moved with the practiced efficiency of officers who had dealt with countless incidents involving tourists and public disturbances, but even they seemed taken aback by the intensity of the crowd's anger and the clear evidence of what had transpired. "Right? What's all this then?" The senior constable, an experienced officer whose calm demeanor provided a stark contrast to the emotional chaos that surrounded him. His presence seemed to give the crowd permission to channel their anger into constructive action. With multiple witnesses immediately stepping forward to provide accounts of what they had observed, that man threw coffee at the guard, called out the elderly veteran, pointing an accusing finger at Marcus while maintaining his position between the perpetrator and any possible escape routes. Completely unprovoked attack on a serving soldier who couldn't defend himself. The constable's eyes immediately moved to Robert, taking in the obvious evidence of coffee stains spread across his immaculate uniform. The visual proof was undeniable and damning, providing clear evidence that an assault had taken place regardless of whatever explanations or excuses. "I've got the whole thing on video," declared the man with the phone, stepping forward eagerly. From the moment he started shouting at the guard to when he threw the coffee, it's all recorded, every second of it. Multiple other phones appeared, with tourists eager to share their recordings and photographs of the incident. The digital evidence was overwhelming, with the attack captured from multiple angles and perspectives, ensuring that there could be no dispute about what had occurred or who was responsible. The junior constable began taking witness statements, writing rapidly in his notebook as person after person stepped forward to provide their account of Marcus's behavior. The consistency of the testimonies was remarkable, with every witness describing the same sequence of events: unprovoked aggression followed by a deliberate assault on a soldier who had maintained perfect discipline throughout the ordeal, was shouting at the guard, demanding attention, reported the tour guide who had been leading a nearby group. The guard maintained his position professionally, never responded to the provocations, and then this gentleman threw his coffee directly at him without any justification whatsoever. Marcus stood in the center of this growing web of evidence and testimony, his face pale and his earlier anger replaced by a dawning recognition of the serious trouble he was facing. The empty coffee cup was still in his hand, serving as additional physical evidence of his actions, and his clothes bore small splashes of coffee that corroborated the witnesses' accounts. "Sir, I need you to remain calm and cooperate," the senior constable said to Marcus, his tone professional but firm. "You're being detained on suspicion of assault. You have the right to remain silent, but anything you do say may be given in evidence. Do you understand?" The formal caution seemed to cut through Marcus's shock, bringing him face to face with the reality that his moment of anger had transformed him from a tourist into a criminal suspect. The legal terminology and official procedures made it impossible to pretend that this was just a misunderstanding that could be resolved with apologies or explanations. "This is ridiculous," Marcus protested weakly, his voice lacking the aggressive confidence that had characterized his earlier behavior. "It was just coffee. I was frustrated, and I lost my temper for a second. Surely that's not a crime." The crowd's reaction to his attempted minimization of his actions was immediate and fierce. Voices rose in fresh outrage at his apparent inability to understand the seriousness of what he had done or to show genuine remorse for his behavior. "Just coffee?" shouted the young mother with indignation. "Out! You assaulted a serving soldier. That's not just anything, that's a serious crime that shows your complete lack of character and decency." The senior constable raised his hand for quiet, his authority immediately respected by the crowd. "I understand everyone's upset, and rightfully so, but I need to conduct this investigation properly." "Sir," he said, turning back to Marcus, "assault is indeed a crime, regardless of the weapon used or the extent of physical harm caused. Throwing any substance at another person without their consent constitutes assault under British law." Yes. Legal reality of his situation was beginning to penetrate Marcus's consciousness, bringing with it the understanding that his actions would have consequences extending far beyond his London vacation. Criminal charges in a foreign country could affect his ability to travel, his employment prospects, and his personal reputation for years to come. Robert, meanwhile, had maintained his position throughout the entire ordeal, his discipline and professionalism serving as a powerful contrast to Marcus's behavior. The coffee stains on his uniform had begun to set, creating permanent evidence of the assault that would require professional cleaning to remove. Despite the obvious discomfort and the unprecedented nature of the attack he had endured, he continued to perform his duties with the same dignity and composure that had characterized his service throughout his military career. "The guard's professionalism has been exemplary," the senior constable noted, speaking to his colleague in a voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Despite being assaulted while performing his duties, he's maintained his position and composure perfectly. That's the mark of true military discipline and training." The praise for Robert's behavior served to highlight even further the contrast between proper conduct and Marcus's actions, emphasizing to everyone present the difference between earned respect and entitled behavior. The crowd murmured their agreement, many expressing their admiration for Robert's handling of an unprecedented situation. As Marcus was formally arrested and prepared for transport to the local police station, the crowd began to disperse, but not before many had taken photos and videos that would soon find their way to social media platforms around the world. The incident was destined to become viral content, with Marcus's face and actions broadcast to millions of viewers, who would judge his behavior and find it as unacceptable as the witnesses had. The cleanup crew that arrived to assist Robert was gentle and respectful, understanding that they were dealing with both practical concerns about his uniform and the dignity of someone who had been assaulted while performing his duties. The coffee stains would eventually be removed, but the incident would be remembered by everyone present as an example of how quickly respect could be lost in consequences. incurred through poor judgment and worse behavior. Marcus's London vacation was effectively over, but his legal troubles were just beginning. The overwhelming evidence against him, combined with the public nature of his actions and the international attention the incident was likely to receive, meant that his moment of anger had created problems that would follow him long after he returned to Arizona. A lesson about respect, consequences, and basic human decency had been delivered with devastating effectiveness, witnessed by hundreds of people who would never forget what they had seen and how justice had ultimately prevailed.